So while we're getting situated up here, I'll just introduce myself briefly. My name is Kate Zeigler. I'm a free-range geologist, and myself and my team work with agricultural producers and communities in northeastern and eastern New Mexico, southeastern Colorado, and western Oklahoma. And what we do is look at aquifers and the geology and the hydrology so that we can help our producers and our communities understand their groundwater resources, and from there come up with management plans and strategies for that resource. And so my role here today is not to geek out like I normally do, but to engage in a conversation with my colleague Daryl Vigil to learn more about thinking about this landscape from his perspective as a member of the Hickory Apache. And so I'm going to let Daryl introduce himself, and then we're just going to riff for a while.
Thank you so much, Kate, and good morning, everybody. Wow, what a beautiful day, and what a beautiful setting, and thank you so much for the invitation, Quivira Coalition, and I learned what coalition means the other day. I was talking to a group of tribal leadership and about Colorado River Basin policy issues, and we had started a conversation called the Tribal Leaders Forum, and tribal leaders thought that forum was too nebulous, so they educated me on what coalition means, when two or more gather for a common purpose, and I thought that was pretty cool. So introductions. For those of you who don't know me, I know some of you, or one of you anyway here today. My name is Daryl Vigil, and I'm a member of the Hickory Apache Nation. I am also part Jemez Pueblo and part Zia Pueblo, which are just Indians point with our lips, so it's just right over that way. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you this morning. My day job is I'm the water administrator for the Hickory Apache Nation. And the Hickory Apache Nation is located in north central New Mexico, 3 miles south of our town of Dulce is 3 miles south of the Colorado-New Mexico border, 25 miles west of Chama, if you guys know where Chama is at. Hickory, a traditional homeland, extends all the way south of Colorado Springs out into the eastern plain, and our kind of our traditional boundaries are the Chama Valley all the way out into the eastern plain. And so my non-day job that I get to do is co-facilitator of the Water and Tribes Initiative. And Water Tribes Initiative is really kind of an ad hoc conversation in the basin about helping to build tribal capacity and enhance tribal capacity, and also to build on a collaborative effort that was already going on in the Colorado River Basin in terms of the renegotiation of the operational framework of the Colorado River. And so definitely got into this line of work 11 years ago. Definitely was not my path in life. I was a hardcore capitalist in terms of I opened my tribe's 2 casinos and set up a couple Section 17 corporations, and my family had a small hotel on the reservation for about 15 years, and that was kind of the trajectory of my life in terms of I was starting to get involved in carbon development because my tribe is an oil and gas tribe. And so was looking to make my millions of dollars by putting more stuff into the air. And almost 12 years ago, I think the creator said, your path is different than that. And so election process, tribal politics aren't very different than other politics. And I was gone from the gaming business. But I thank those tribal leaders who fired me that day, because it absolutely gave me a chance to be a part of, do what I do today. And absolutely the river, Colorado River, and all rivers that are sacred to Hickory, which are the Rio Grande, the Colorado, the Pecos, and the Arkansas, all have given me voice in terms of, what I think is important in terms of what's going on today. And a really close friend of mine, I think a lot of you might know him, Brian Richter, asked me, and made the recommendation to Quivira for me to be able to share today. And I'm very, very grateful that he did that, because I didn't know anything about Quivera or this coalition, but I trust in the relationships that I've built over the last 10 years. And if he thought it was important that I talk to you, then I'm here. And so with that said, a lot of things going on in the world right now, as I'm sure that you guys have talked about. I'm really sorry I haven't been engaged in the conversation more the last couple of days, but the renegotiation of the operational guidelines of the Colorado River, and why is that important to New Mexico? Why is that important to the West? Why is that important to the world? Climate change and the impacts of drought. And how do those, impact tribal nations? And how do we fit into the whole picture in terms of those things that we have to offer in terms of living sustainably in this area for thousands of years? And what is it that we can actually do, to start to think of a jointly created future? And absolutely the land-water nexus is so important. And so I think lots of introduction, and so really, wanted to kind of work with Kate today about, just having a conversation about, maybe what might be important to you all and important to in terms of, the work that we do, or work that I do, and the work that she does. And we were kind of laughing about that, because my work 10 years ago, the relationships I made almost right away and instantly were those in the science community. And tribes and science, for whatever reason, have, I think because we deal in reality, we make fast partners in terms of those things that are important to us. And so there's been a foundation built on that. And one of the things that's going on right now is absolutely, as you guys understand, the acceptance of, the science that's been developed and continues to be explored about how we're going to live sustainably into the future. So thank you for that, and I think we're going to get started.
Okay, so the first question that I have, and this is a conversation that we've been carrying on for a few days now, in reading an article about you, there was a comment made in that article that talked about how indigenous groups said the river has shaped the culture and heritage. And so in thinking about this, there's this comment that the river has shaped culture and heritage. And threading into that, your comment just now about the sacredness of the rivers. And now the rivers are managed. They're under compact. We shape them. And so how does that transition from the river shaping people to the people shaping rivers? If you can speak to that big concept.
Can you ask that again? No, just kidding.
So thinking about,
I'm just kidding.
right? The landscape used to shape us, and now we shape and manage the landscape. And speaking to that transition, and what does that forebode for the future in terms of how that has changed dramatically in our relationship to our landscape?
Yeah, and it's funny you asked that question, and we had been having this conversation, but when you ask it now, I go all over the place with it in terms of, who we've been, as a people, as long as we know that we've been that and in our DNA and who we are. And when we talk about, currently, the river shaping, who we are, and river shaping cultures, it's a lot different perspective than what I've been taught as an indigenous person, in terms of the absolute humility of being able to know that we're part of a greater whole. And just a little bit of context, and I'll use the Colorado River Compact as an example, was created in 1922. And if I provide a little bit of context, from my tribe, and so the framework and the apportionment of the Colorado River happened in 1922. My tribe was just subsistence living, having just been placed 40 years earlier on the reservation and living off government rations. So and then you fast forward, my tribe settled its water rights in 1992. So you have 100 years of policy that had already been existing, and the interesting thing about the Colorado River Compact, it's been acknowledged that it was based on false hydrology too. And so that becomes really important in terms of the science conversation, in terms of acknowledgement of facts. And so we get into the game almost 100 years late, you know, and there's an expectation from those partners in terms of state sovereigns and the federal sovereigns that we're supposed to have this figured out. And the fundamental law of the river says it does not apply to us. And so that's where we're at today. You know, an absolute inability, even though the tribes in the Colorado River Basin have rights of over 25% of the volume of the Colorado River, you know, we have no place to engage in the policy-making process. And what does that mean, you know, in terms of the future of the West? When you're talking about 7 basin states, 41 million people, 2 countries, 30 tribal sovereigns, and the 7th largest economy in the world, yes, it's absolutely important. And so how have tribes gone about, you know, yes, we could probably litigate and take our chances in court, but, you know, kind of the strategy has been about, in tribes' mind, is yes, building that capacity so hopefully that we can engage responsibly in the policy-making process, but even more importantly, to execute who we are in terms of who we are inside and in our DNA, about, you know, thinking about, you know, a holistic approach to the problem solving. And where does that lie? You know, the last 10 years, through numerous different, you know, particularly the 10 Tribes Partnership of the Colorado River, have engaged in absolutely an effort to create relatedness and to create understanding about tribes and tribal water rights. And that maybe, you know, living sustainably in this area, we may have some, you know, best practices and things that may be helpful, you know, for the conversation that's going on right now. But we don't have an ability to do that. And so when we talk about the river shaping our culture, it absolutely has, you know, the policy of the river that's been shaped absolutely has prevented indigenous people from actually being who they are, in terms of allowing us to can you imagine that? But, you know, allowing us to be able to be stewards, you know, of the water and the land to the extent that we would like to. And so when we imagine, you know, how, you know, the river has shaped culture in the West, you know, it's absolutely impacted who we are as a people. And it's you know, absolutely amazing to me that the partnerships and the connections and this absolute spider web of people, you know, who have the same common values as indigenous folks do. And Kate and I had a lot of conversation about this, and I think this is really important. I really appreciate the fact that she brought this up, because she talked about, I think, 4th generation Irish, and talking about this is her sense of place now. And you know, can you imagine, you know, absolutely honor each and every one of you's sense of place. And if it's in this country and if it's in this area, absolutely it's grounded in that same sense of place that indigenous folks have. And so it's not different, it's just amplified by thousands of years. And so if you can imagine that, you know, we have that same sense of place, the same sense of value to the water and to the land that we live on, then wow, what a place, what a foundation to build from. And absolutely, you know, it's going to continue to shape culture, and culture defined as, you know, those practices that we live today. And so absolutely it shapes cultures, and it's going to continue to shape the culture. But the reality is that, you know, if we don't take care of it now, there may not be a river. And the reality for tribes is that if the hydrology continues to decrease in the basin, we may not even be able to develop our water rights that it took us so long to be able to get. So absolutely shaping the culture of what we do and everything that we do inside tribal governance. And just one last thing is, you know, on my Pueblo side, absolutely understand the nature and the importance and the sacredness of farming. And I grew up in that culture, watching my grandpa and my grandparents, both at Jemez and Zia, go into the fields every single day. And wow, what an incredible lifestyle. And that's the thing, is that we want to continue to be able to live who we are as a people, but a lot of times we're confined to the policy that dictates, who we can be as a people. And so really trying to reshape the landscape of who we are and the absolute opportunity that we have to jointly create a future together.
So I want to build on your this concept of love of a place, and Wagon Mound is one of my second homes here in New Mexico, and it's home to Norteño families, very old, deep traditions out there, relatively speaking, and as a geologist, very relatively speaking. But a word that was taught to me in the last few years was the concept of querencia, which is that deep and abiding love and relationship with a place or a landscape. And so thinking about this concept of each of us having our own unique relationship with the landscape that we hold very dear, how do we, as all these different people from all these different depths of time, and you and I have gotten on our soapboxes about the State Water Plan together, but thinking about how to craft policy to honor this landscape with all these different entrances of different generations of people who've come to have that sense of love, and how do we bind very different interests and very different cultures and very different times to craft a way to help this landscape.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that, when we talk about how we shape policy and how it's crafted, but I want to first say, I want to acknowledge that, I have a couple of my two oldest children's grandparents are from the San Luis Valley, and they're Hispanic. And they were original Spanish settlers in the El Rito area. And so inside my own family, I have a whole lot of diversity in terms of, the lineage that my family has. And so absolutely honor, those things in terms of, those New Mexicans and those who have made this their sense of place, generations and generations of folks. And I think, on a community level, those relationships, absolutely have grown and been fostered, but, policy divides us. And so when I start to think about, specific examples, in terms of, how we move forward, again, I'll use the Colorado River Basin as an example, because that's where I do most of my work, because that's where my tribe gets its water from diversions from the Colorado River in the San Juan Basin. And, one of the things that I found 10, 12 years ago is that, how siloed the conversations are, and how policy has siloed those conversations. And policy at the beginning is, from the get-go, sometimes is to protect and defend, rather to really, talk about building collaboratives. And so when I first got involved with this, I saw, that, the exclusion of environmental conversations. I saw the exclusion of the ag community. I saw the exclusion of tribal voices. I saw the exclusion of conservation and NGOs who wanted to be helpful in this process. And I really saw that that in my mind, the only pathway was to create a process of inclusion, so where all voices are heard. And how do you do that? I mean, it's quite a task, in terms of considering the enormity of the West and all the voices that are included. But, really have undertaken that over the last 10 years to hopefully build a foundation of understanding. And where we're at right now is that work is finally coming to a head in terms of, like, absolutely there's a conversation in the world right now, or in the West, about the need for tribes to be included in the policy-making process. And the only reason that we've gotten to this point is because we've created that relatedness. And I've spoken at so many different functions exactly like this, where I've gotten to meet you folks, and I've got to connect with you, and I've gotten to create relatedness to you about, our specific, my tribe-specific issues, and then maybe broader indigenous folks' issues in the basin. And what do we find? We find that commonality. And we find those things that that overlap, that we can start to build a foundation of understanding. And yeah, we're not going to agree on everything, but one of the things that I found in my work with the Water and Tribes Initiative is in 2019, my business partner, Dr. Matt McKinney from the University of Montana, underwent an interview process where we interviewed almost 150 people in the Colorado River Basin, representing the 7 basin states, NGOs, conservation groups, Mexico, the federal government, anybody who we could talk to. And one of the most interesting things I found was that, when we asked the question, please let us know, the question was, what is your personal and professional relationship to the river? Most of the time was spent on people talking about their personal value and their personal experience of the Colorado River. And wow, almost unanimously, that was the value. But, the policy absolutely is, puts people in opposition to their own personal values. And so kind of creating this groundswell and this movement of connecting people and building relationships, in my mind, absolutely is a way to build policy in the future where all voices are included.
And so building now on that, and a comment you made earlier that I think is very, very powerful, is the role of science in that policy development. So in my role, I serve as a member of the New Mexico Water Dialogue Board, and I represent northeastern New Mexico, the agricultural communities. And our role at the Water Dialogue, for those of y'all not familiar with it, is that we're a voice for the area we represent to the Interstate Stream Commission for water planning in New Mexico. And for me, in the area that I represent, we don't have much surface water. So our resources are almost entirely groundwater, which is invisible. And so when you think about trying to manage a resource that we can't see and we don't have a whole lot of data for yet, thinking about this concept of not only building policy by relationship building, but that appropriate integration of science. And so from your perspective, with your own observational science and relationships with scientists, bringing this sort of threefold thing together, the policy, the people relationships, and the science relationships, what would sort of be your thoughts about that sort of final merging of these things?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, to me, because one of my really good friends is a guy named Brad Udall, and Brad Udall is one of the foremost climatologists, and especially dealing with climate issues and drought in the Southwest. And one of the things he said just recently was he talks about he calls himself a skunk because he's always giving such, bad kind of information, or in the minds of most people, kind of gloom and doom information. But, I think the science world has been, saying this for last maybe 10, 15 years about, the urgency in dealing with, some of these issues that we're dealing with. And there's an absolute sense of frustration in terms of my science friends about an inability to create a listening in the general public, and how their efforts are to just throw more information at folks, and hopefully that it'll stick somewhere in terms of the realities of our current climate and drought situation and the impacts on all water sources, including groundwater sources. And as we start to craft and create a water future for this area, absolutely that has to be taken into consideration. And one of the things I want to acknowledge absolutely is, the relationships that I've made in terms of the farming ag community. I met a gentleman named Peter O'Toole from the Family Farm Alliance about a month ago in Boulder. and creating those relationships in terms of like an understanding of what they're doing. And Imperial Irrigation District in Southern California, Dr. Enrique Martinez and Tina Shields are my good friends there too. My point is that, ag community and farming community absolutely is, uses some of the best science available. And what can we learn from that in the broader community in terms of what you are all up to, in terms of what you do? That absolutely is a value in my mind. And how is it that, we absolutely take into account that science, and I go back to, because it's such an easy example, the framers of the Colorado River Compact knew the hydrology was false, but they went with it anyway. And look at when we build something on a faulty foundation, 100 years later, we're still dealing with the impacts of that.
And sort of building on that, and this is a story that I told you yesterday, I had a young and principled graduate student accompany me into the field. And we were sitting with one of the ranchers that I've dealt with for a very long time, monitoring his wells. And she said to him, well, how can you not believe in global warming? And he said, it doesn't matter to some extent whether I believe or whose fault it is or how that's happening. What matters to me as the person at the bottom of the food chain, the person who is the foundation of the food system, is I don't understand what my weather is doing anymore. And I'm the one who has to figure out when to move my cattle. And when the grass isn't growing when it used to grow, and the rains aren't coming when they used to come, and the snow's not coming like it used to be, I can no longer predict how I need to do my own management to produce the food that you have to eat. And so when we think about this rapid change that's happening, and those who are on the ground, and some with a much deeper and longer understanding of change that has happened in the past, and as we roll through this time of change now, and you made a comment to me that it's not the new normal, it's the new abnormal, and this hyper variability, how can we collaboratively work to try to cope with something that we don't fully understand, even though scientifically we have a concept of what should happen, but we haven't lived it yet. So are there ways for us to learn to be adaptable in the face of something that's so dynamic and hard to catch?
Yeah, I believe so, but I'll always be a hopeless optimist, I think, and because and thinking about again what Brad Udall has said, that he thinks this is an aridification, and he talks about this not being the new normal but the new abnormal, and the reason he says that is because it's unpredictable. I think we're all kind of experiencing those weather patterns, and I'm really triggered by the word belief. Do you believe something? Because that puts it in a whole different realm of kind of personal morality, and that doesn't really address the issues that we actually need to deal with on the ground. And so when we're talking about climate change and drought and those things that we're experiencing, absolutely know, from a firsthand experience of what I see on my own reservation. And, having been, trying to be traditionally hunter-gatherers and trying to be taught how to be ranchers and farmers, there's families who've adopted that lifestyle on our reservation. And there's a few generations of ranchers now who value that lifestyle. But the reality is that we may not be able to sustain that new adopted lifestyle because of hydrology and the drought. And for us, it's real in terms of the impacts that we see on the ground.
So just one last question before we'll open it up to questions. But you shared with me that the Hickory Apache are about to be the first to create a very unique relationship with the state of New Mexico. And I was wondering if you could share that story and that success.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, been doing this work in the Colorado River Basin on behalf of my tribe, like I said, because that's where our water rights are at, and that's where we can develop our water rights. And just to give you some kind of context, right now, for the last 3 years, when we've been unable to develop 25,000 acre feet of our water rights stored in Navajo Dam because an inability to there's no market for it, number one, in the Four Corners with the shutdown of the Four Corners power plants, and that was our biggest lease. And so we have no ability to take that water outside of state boundaries. There's not a market locally, even with the ag community, because all that water is already accounted for. And so there's this water that just goes down the river for free that we can't use. And right now in the upper basin, 60% and close to 500,000 acre feet of water rights that tribes own and hold title to in the upper basin is unused and goes down the river for free because we can't use it. So we saw an opportunity with the state of New Mexico where the New Mexico, you hear a lot about water is life. And you hear a lot about, how we don't have it in New Mexico. 2012, 2013, my tribe did a first of its kind auction with the University of California, Berkeley, in New Mexico for our San Juan Chama water. We went out to over 160 entities in the Rio Grande Basin, and we got 3 bidders the first year, 4 bidders the next year. And we're talking about groundwater recharge uses as well, because we're pretty flexible in how we can lease our water. And so the state of New Mexico, continues to talk about this, and she mentioned the 50-year water plan, but there's really no substance in our mind to that in terms of, an ability to develop our water rights in New Mexico. So we told the state of New Mexico, well, if you're serious about water is life, and you're serious about keeping New Mexico water within New Mexico boundaries, then you need to put your money where your mouth is. And so we started the dialogue with the state engineer's office and the Interstate Stream Commission about leasing water to the state strategic water reserve, which has never been done before. If we are going to create a water future in the state of New Mexico, then we need to create it jointly. And going through that process, we did the legal due diligence of looking for other transactions that were similar to this. And the thing that we found was, really disappointing in that there was no other sovereign to sovereign transaction in the state of New Mexico up till 2021, considering the long history that natives have had with the state of New Mexico, there was no sovereign to sovereign transaction. So we're creating this transaction as a foundational kind of transaction where the tribe will lease to the state strategic water reserve as one sovereign to the other sovereign. And what does this do? Hopefully it creates the foundation of how the state sovereign deals with the tribal sovereign as a sovereign and as an equal partner in terms of their self-determined and being able to be self-determined in their ability to deal with those issues with the state. And then hopefully that'll create the framework again of a recognition and a respect for tribal sovereignty that absolutely is going to be needed when we talk about creating a water future together. And if there's not an understanding about that, then there's going to be that uncertainty again. And I think that's something that we're all looking for right now, is to create that certainty. And how can you do that if you don't have a relationship, a sovereign to sovereign relationship, but a sovereign ward relationship? And being that, Navajo and Hickory are 2 largest tribal water rights holders in New Mexico, that's absolutely kind of the mindset that we have in terms of, we're already in the broader communities. And if you have an understanding of what we're doing, how is it that we can help each other? And, we've done things like leases to the Rio Chama Sequia Association. We have relationships with the Sequia Norteños and those kind of relationships that have existed for a long, long time. People just don't know about it. And so we're really trying to highlight those relationships too in this first of its kind transaction. And hopefully it'll be a springboard for what can happen and what's possible that's not happening in terms of state-tribal relationships.
Any last thoughts before we turn it over to the audience?
I just want to say, before I answer questions, if you all have any questions, thank you so much for allowing me to share a little bit about, what we're doing. And we've produced, when I say we, the Water and Tribes Initiative has produced a series of policy briefs. And if you Google the Water and Tribes Initiatives, all those are meant to be informative in terms of hopefully, to anybody in the basin. And so I would definitely encourage you to do that. And then the 10 Tribes Partnership of the Colorado River conducted a tribal water study, an absolutely important document in terms of the foundational agreements that it made between tribes and the federal government.
All right, so we'll turn it over to y'all for questions for Daryl.
I'm going to start with Blue Set, and then I'll come to you, Kirk.
Thank you very much for your informed discussion this morning. My question or questions are around procedure or process. And what I heard you say was that somewhere in policy, the discussion around value has been lost, or that policy does not reflect the values of those that make it. And so my question would be, how would you frame on a systemic level the ability to start with a value system first, so that the policy, whether it's about solving a problem or preventing a problem, is based in value first? And I have a follow-up question if we have time.
Well, I think what comes to mind real quickly is a real specific example about what we're trying to do in Glen Canyon. And in Glen Canyon, as you know, Lake Powell the levels are going historically low. And what it's doing, it's starting to reveal, historic sites again, and sacred sites that were drowned, when the dam was built. And so part of, and we're doing it in collaboration with science community and some other folks who work with the Glen Canyon Adaptive Management Program. But one of the things that we're looking at is that, rather than looking at it, going in first from the standpoint of having tribal spiritual leaders determine if something needs to be, put to rest, or we need to welcome it back. And when we're thinking about policy engagement, retraining, the conventional wisdom of how we do that, because the scientists were like, well, we'll get some tribes out there, but no, I mean, if we're going to value this and give it the level of sacredness that it deserves, then we need to ask all those tribes who had sacred sites in Glen Canyon first about what they want to do with it. And then we can go back in with, on top of that with the science and those things that, obviously are important, but absolutely that will shape that particular policy in the, kind of the revealing of Glen Canyon again. And so if Glen Canyon's coming back, there were thousands and thousands of archaeological sacred sites there. And with the lake levels coming back down, those are being revealed again. And so that's one just specific example of how we can start to shape value into that particular process. But doing that on the basin-wide level is definitely something we tried to do with that particular document that we did called Toward the Sense of the Basin, where we really captured, this is really what people value. And if that's the case, it should be inclusive in the policy-making process.
Also wanted to thank both of you for your discussions and sharing your knowledge. Mr. Vigil, you mentioned a couple of times the faulty hydrology of the Colorado River, and I'm not familiar with what that is. I'm wondering if other people might also not know, and it's probably a big subject, but could you explain that a little bit more, and do you think that it also perhaps applies to the Rio Grande?
Absolutely, it does. And 1922, they did a 10-year running average of the Colorado River. They said that it was 15 million acre feet. The actual running average was closer to 14 point some million acre feet. So we were already starting with false hydrology. And then what the Colorado River Compact did is that it apportioned it between the upper and lower basins, 7.5 that the upper basin would get, and 7.5 that the upper basin would deliver to the lower basin, because the lower basin doesn't really produce any water. And right now, we're still trying to maintain those apportionments when the actual hydrology of the river now is closer to 13 million acre feet. And still trying to fulfill those delivery obligations, even though the hydrology doesn't support it. And guess what's supporting it right now? Unused tribal water. and until we start to clarify that, and that's been the conversation. It's about, it's not, the conversations get collapsed for tribes because it's not that we don't believe in conservation, but we're just barely at a point where we're starting to be able to develop those water rights. And most of those water rights are already integrated into the broader communities that we live in anyway. It's just, clarifying them and acknowledging them. And so we imagine, can you imagine that they're predicting, we're having conversations now that within the next few years, that hydrology can go down to 11 million acre feet. And if that's the case, what does that mean? We need to rethink that. But those who are entrenched and have been benefiting from this, of course, want to keep it that way at the expense and the death of the river itself, which makes no sense. And for those of you who don't know, right now at the at the U.S.-Mexico border, at Morales Dam, there is no more Colorado River. You look out over Morales Dam, and it's like this right there. I mean, what a sad thing that the biggest river in the West, the one thing that feeds us and quenches our thirst, that it doesn't exist, that it doesn't flow to the Sea of Cortez anymore. And so when we think about, we mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I think it's so important, we think about the ecosystem and we think about the endangered species of fish, and we spend so much money recovering those endangered species of fish. But to understand that, ecosystems, that we're part of the ecosystem. And the more, things that we take out of the food chain, we're part of that food chain. And ultimately, what does that mean for us? And so really addressing those really hard conversations now about what does apportionment look like in the future? And because this structure that we're working on is already, it doesn't work. And those folks who are proponents of incrementalism want to build on that when it's already broken.
So if I can add a note of clarification to that, when we think about apportioning a river, be it the Colorado, the Rio Grande, the Pecos, the Arkansas, these compacts divide the water by strict volume, not by proportion of the water that's in the river. So what happens is we owe Texas, Mexico, whoever, we owe them of an actual volume, not a proportion of what's in the river today. So when we're in severe drought, Texas is always suing us for their water because we haven't delivered the 5 buckets of water we promised them instead of the 5% of the water that we had. And so when he's speaking to these absolute volumes, I mean, it may not seem like much to go from 13 million to 11 million acre feet, but that's a lot of water that's not there anymore. And when we're bound by law to provide a set fixed amount to someone downstream and we don't have to give it to them, it makes that problem so much worse. And so that's another part of the fundamental story of that hydrology that's wrong, as well as that rolling average being crafted in unusually wet years. And so those set volumes came during a time when that river was flowing higher than it traditionally does.
And just one more thing about, I know we're running close to time, but, why is the Colorado River, so important to New Mexico? if you guys seen, the Rio Grande as it comes into New Mexico, there's not much left after, what's taken out from the San Luis Valley. And if it wasn't for the Colorado River and the San Juan Chama project, the Rio Grande would be dry a lot of the time, and the other thing is that the largest municipality in New Mexico gets its water from the Colorado River. And that's why it's so important to New Mexico to be engaged in these conversations about the Colorado River. And one of our largest leases that we have through the San Juan Chama project is with the Bureau of Reclamation, and it's to keep the river wet and to keep the silver and minnow wet. And so when we think about, Colorado River water, it absolutely impacts, New Mexico in terms of its allocation.
Any further questions, or are we at time? I've lost track.
I think we can maybe take one more question. We'll run over time a little bit, but
We had someone up. There's a microphone coming.
I just want to echo the gratitude to you both for being here. It's fascinating and excellent work. This is a broader question, but one of the things that's most discouraging to me about our current climate seems to be the increasing skepticism and disbelief in science. And I just think it's so important to get people like you out into gatherings like this and even beyond. And do you as scientists have further thoughts about how we can, increase some credibility here? Thank you.
And I was just going to say a couple. Just thank you so much, Kate, for facilitating this. We were kind of thinking, how are we going to do this? And then the last thing is, Hickory Apache is, part of their creation story. Talks about a race around the world. The birds had a race around the world. And so at our feast time at Gojia, September 15th, we have a traditional foot race, and where we emulate, we paint it like birds. And so I think it was so meaningful to me this morning because we take turns, the head runner takes turns either being an eagle or a sandhill crane. And I saw a lot of those today, so very moving for me.
And thank you for the opportunity to have this dialogue.
Thank you.
As
Thank you all.
someone very young to the landscape. But to speak to your point, as someone who is a free-range scientist, that makes it, in a way, a little easier for folks like me to be on the ground, to be embedded in our communities, and to be a part of our communities. And so for me to share how I understand the world and to learn from y'all your understanding of the world so that you know why I think what I think, instead of my just throwing a bunch of stuff at you, numbers, graphs, big words, and saying, thou shalt. That's not the way that we're going to get science incorporated into management or into decision making if it's top down, us sitting in our ivory towers, commanding that thou shalt obey because I have a bunch of letters after my name. Okay, I have a bunch of gibberish after my name. Great. But to me, the idea is that, and this is something we talked about a little bit too, is policy forms best when you build in, what the lady had asked earlier, the hope, the fundamental spirituality, the understanding of this world, but also when you build that relationship from the bottom and you translate that policy upwards. And so the people who know this land, whose land is in their blood, this sense of querencia, that should be what drives the policy. And scientists need to be down there in the landscape with the people instead of up top waving our arms around, because that, I think, only widens that chasm between those of us who have gone through the training and the time and the education to understand the rocks and the water and the animals and all of that. And how do we communicate it to you if there's that yawning gap because you don't know me? I haven't sat and had a cup of coffee with you. I haven't poked your rocks with a stick and told you all about why they're cool. So that's my 2 cents. That's my soapbox. So.
Yeah, and I call myself the accidental water guy because this was not my path, and and absolutely needed the information early on in terms of the reality of our particular situations, and absolutely have made incredible friendships and lifelong friendships with the science world and the science community, and absolutely get their sincere commitment in terms of forwarding who we are as a people. And I think that's kind of the shift. It's not once you really you get to know the likes of like Brad Udall, you really get his commitment in terms of this planet, and the scientists are pretty fascinating in terms of the recovery work that they're doing with these endangered species of fish and habitat restoration. Absolutely amazing, because it absolutely those practices and those things that they study absolutely apply to who we are as human beings.